knew, and perhaps they knew that when they arranged a stable for him. There was no room at the inn, but one might suspect that even if there were, the Essenes would not have preferred that he be born there in the one inn that existed in Bethlehem, because the inn that night was a place of rabble-rousing, of drinking, of celebration, the things that might happen when all of these people come together and the hillsides are filled with tents, and there's this great influx of people registering as they were for this counting of Herod the Great. Something that they hated, but in the times of hate, one attempts to make themselves feel better by drinking and partying. And so that was the consciousness about the place in the minds of the people. But the Essenes found a still quiet place in a cave, removed from the inn where this birth might take place. And so he came, and the shepherds sitting on the hillsides, who were perhaps watching the skies and the stars, and through doing so, with their music, with the gentle care of the sheep, and their minds being in a receptive atmosphere, as one might be sitting alone at night, they fell into meditation. Surely they would, quite naturally. They must have been among the greatest meditators of Israel simply from having the job of sitting alone at night and contemplating the stars and thinking of and talking about the Messiah. And so their consciousness was ready. They were prepared. When the light shone, it seemed as if the heavens themselves burst. If there were a moment, even in our day and time, when any individual prepared himself for the expression of the Christ so perfectly that all that God is could express through one individual, surely the conditions of the earth and the atmosphere around us would have to react in some way. If a power that is greater than the laws that govern the planet enter the planet in a single moment, certainly the planet reacts to this greater power entering into a lesser power and expressing itself within it. And so the heavens did react, and the earth responded, and light shone, and the music of the spheres became the music in the atmosphere, and the child entered. It was a short time after that that the astrologers had convinced both the mother and the father of this child that it was not safe for them to remain. Obviously, Herod was looking for him, and if he did not find him in one way, perhaps he would try some drastic measures, the kinds of measures that he was known for, to try to destroy him in another. And so Joseph had a dream and was told to take the child in Egypt. But perhaps more than the dream, the wise men themselves, the astrologers, warned that he must be taken out of the country because Herod will stop at nothing to destroy him. And so they set about the journey. And Herod, only a step behind them, sent his soldiers into Bethlehem to destroy all male children who were born during that period of time. And so there was a great slaughter of innocent babies as this new child, this man who was to be called God, is here with us, Emmanuel, was taken away into Egypt. They traveled until they came to this same village on the banks of the Nile, Heliopolis, and the child began to study from his earliest days there with both the Essene teachers and with the initiates of ancient Egypt, who had taken the opportunity. Heliopolis is almost in the shadows of the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid. And so those who were committed to the ancient rites of initiation were there within the community. And within this center of dedication, of teaching, Cleopatra was gone, Herod the Great had died, and a new day was beginning to come, a new thought was occurring. And Jesus was growing up in this atmosphere of absolute dedication to wisdom, knowledge, understanding, both the understanding of the cosmos that was the purpose of the initiates of ancient Egypt, and the Essene understanding of the mystical truth of both the Messiah, the Christ, and of the Old Testament. And in this atmosphere he grew, he flourished. And just a few miles away, that great university teaching geometry and the newest discoveries of the world, new discoveries in navigation, new discoveries about the universe itself, about the relationship of the earth to the sun, and their archaic beliefs of astrology, the astrology of the Essenes, was laughed at in the University of Alexandria. Now the science was astronomy, not astrology. And since they had discovered the relationship of these heavenly bodies, they no longer believed that they had any purpose in the affairs of man, but they were wise, worldly wise. And they had things to give, and this young man seemed to be of a nature and character that could listen to their discoveries, and instead of thinking the recent discovery that the earth is not the center of the universe, and that the earth moves around the sun instead of the sun moving around the earth, the Jews refused to believe it. But this young man seemed to have an awareness, it only expresses all the more, that that light that comes to us and feeds us is the expression of God, expressing himself in the universe and sending his consciousness to us. Perhaps he had the ability to hear the wisdom of the worldly wise and to throw out of it its attempt to discredit the religious belief or the spiritual belief, and at the same time to hear spiritual truths and see that they did not, in fact, contradict the new discoveries of the worldly wise. This ability to experience the balance between the two became the source of his wisdom. He had the knowledge of the latest discovery and at the same time the commitment to spiritual truth that allowed him to put that in a context that he could use to better understand and explain and teach about the wisdom of God. As he began to grow, coming perhaps near the time that he would be established in majority in Israel, the time of his bar mitzvah, it was long time that they should return to Israel. And so they set about with a caravan coming near to Israel, and one can perhaps see the image of Jesus, the oldest son, and now with his younger brother and sister, James and Ruth, born in Egypt, setting out with a family, with a caravan, moving across the desert, facing all of the dangers of moving across. And I have an image of the excitement of Jesus looking out from the caravan at robbers that might appear at any moment, perhaps disappointed that they didn't, as all young boys of his age would be looking for the excitement of that, as the guards were changed every night and as the caravan moved slowly for a period in the morning and stopping in the heat of the day, moving again in the afternoon and stopping again in the evening, moving again toward darkness and then pitching the tent every night. And after 6 weeks of this, it must have seemed to Jesus and his little brother and sister as if this had been what they always did, this way of life, moving across the desert in a caravan. But it was different from life in Egypt, because now stories were told around the campfire. They had time with their mother and the father, and the teachings of Israel were given to them. It was a time of sharing, a time of growth, and perhaps a particular delight to the youngsters who were a part of it. As they came near to Hebron, they became aware that Archelaus had given up attempting to make friends with Israel, and he was particularly disgusted with the constant new messiahs that were coming and trying to overthrow both his kingdom and the kingdom of Rome. They seemed to come out of the hills every other day, and some of them with reasonable success. One man named Judah had led a band of marauders that had come again and again and again, and he just couldn't get rid of them. The man seemed to have some kind of energy or strength that caused the people to believe in him, and he was reputed almost throughout Israel to be the real Messiah, particularly because Archelaus just couldn't get rid of him. And when he would be overcome in one battle, he seemed to gather a fresh band and come again. But as they neared Israel, they came across the remnants of this band and received the news that Archelaus was particularly suspicious of anyone coming into the country from outside, that these might be supporters, that these might be spies, that they might be people attempting to take over the throne. And so they had to go around to circumvent the entirety of southern Israel and go up the Jordan Valley to get to where they were attempting to reach. And going through the Jordan Valley, they became aware of another man who was being sought in Israel. The entire army was looking for him. He was a man called John ben Zechariah. And Jesus and Mary and Joseph recognized the name. He was, in fact, the son of Mary's sister. And he had become important in Israel already. Being a bit older than Jesus, he had already begun to make of himself a nuisance to the powers that be, with his determined speaking out, even as a youngster, against the power of Rome and the power of Herod. And so they went up through the Jordan Valley and came into a place called Nazareth. Not really a town as yet. It was more like an encampment, a place where a group of the Essenes had gathered around a spring that came out of the hillside there, and had made for themselves a little commune, one of the communities of the Essenes that gathered. And it was there that this young man would grow through his early days. Joseph set up his carpenter shop and began to serve the community with his trade as a craftsman. And Jesus began to learn of the relationship between the people of the community there and the soldiers that were ever present. A tolerance of the soldiers. They treated them with almost common courtesy. And the adults didn't really overtly do anything unkind to them, but they turned their heads when the children did. It was a popular pastime of the children to throw rocks at the soldiers, and in any way they could to antagonize them. The adults always apologized because they were good merchants, and they knew that they must keep their economy alive by at least tolerating them. They were never invited into the homes. They were treated almost civilly, but certainly not with anything akin to friendship. And Jesus grew up watching this relationship of the people who were politely called the strangers in our midst, and the people who were committed to the teaching, the spiritual teaching, and the nationalistic fervor of Egypt. In these conditions he grew. And he studied the relationship between these and asked within himself, what is right? How do we relate to the stranger in our midst? And how do I understand the teaching that the Messiah is to come? While the Essenes knew, and his mother and father knew, it was a well-kept secret. They could not speak out. They couldn't say to the public at all, this child is the Messiah, for fear that his life would be destroyed. And so it had never been said to him either. He grew up learning about the Messiah and learning the teachings of Israel and of Egypt and of Chaldea. And all of the people wondering, perhaps all of the teachers and his parents, when will he know? Will we have to tell him? How will we tell him? And how will he accept the news that this is his life and his purpose? We're going to stop there for a brief break, and we'll come back and talk about that discovery and what he did with it.
We all went to our wishing well for what we wished we could not tell. We heard keeping secret would help our dream come true. With the countless pennies we already threw, you called your wish out loud and clear, hoping all the world would hear about the love you see within us all. Yes, you were praying everyone would heed the call, but we were leaning so far into our well, echoes were all that we heard. So we went tumbling down with well wishes. It felt like a mighty long drive. Now if we ever get to the bottom of this, we might even come out on top. Bottoms up or down depends on where your come and going tends, but anywhere the water will be met. So don't you panic, we won't sink, but we'll get wet. There's someone here to fish us out, the one who was always about to lower the bucket so we can hold the line, to pull us up and we'll all come out just fine. Though we are drowning our waterlogged dreams, it seems, after drinking our wishing well dry. Look back down, you can see all your change, spare change. You're tossed in a time now gone by, and you begin to see it makes good sense through all the pretense, even though you're still wondering why. Now you leave all that behind and wake up to your brand new mind, finding all the lost change that you ever threw, and that a wishing well all the time was you. Yes, that a wishing well all the time was you. Wishing well all the time was you. Just that old wishing well all the time was you.
Israel was very much a country of intrigue, both political and religious, and the religious was political during the time of Christ's growing up. And during the time when he was in Nazareth, the family, including his cousins and his friends from around the shores of Galilee, spent a lot of time worshiping with the Essenes, both at Carmel, which is not that far from Nazareth, and on the banks of the Jordan, both of which were considerably easier to reach than to go to Jerusalem. But even those people who were committed to the teachings of the Essenes still considered the temple in Jerusalem to be a sacred place, and as often as possible would go there for the Passover. It wasn't always easy, particularly now that the country was divided between the north and the south. People seldom crossed from the northern part, from Galilee, into the south for a number of reasons. And one of those reasons included the fact that the ruling body of the Supreme Court of Israel, which was really the rulership that Israel recognized, the high priest and the judges of the Sanhedrin were considered by the people to be the rulers that God had chosen, as opposed to the rulership of Rome that had imposed itself upon them. But even this rulership was split into two parts. In the south, about Jerusalem, the court was ruled by the Sadducees. The Sadducees were probably thought of in that time as a modern kind of sect, and very liberal, in the sense that their teaching tended to be that the keeping of the law was important to the letter, but there was no mystical quality to the teaching. I mean, life was here and now, and it was to be lived here and now, and there's not really a heaven or a hell or a life after death. It had become something of a social religion, and the high priest was one of that Sadducee sect. And the larger sect, the larger group of the people, belonged to a sect called the Pharisees. The Pharisees were the fundamentalists of the time. They believed in a very literal interpretation of the law, and very strong traditions. The teachings, in fact, of the Pharisee teachers had come to have as much impact and as much import as the law itself. The law was given by Moses, and it was stated as the law was given by Moses that there was not and never would be another man who could add to or take away from the law. So, according to the literal teaching, that law was sacred in and of itself, and nothing else matched that in importance. However, the rabbis from that time until the present had made interpretations of that law so that there could be an argument. What does this really mean? Are we really to do absolutely nothing on the Sabbath? And so the rabbis gave an expansion of that and said, this is the way to do it, and that's the way to do it. And these interpretations became law themselves. And the Pharisees had quite an abundance of these applications, and looked down on the Sadducees, considering them somewhat heretics. And both of these sects of Judaism tended to reject the Essenes. They did, in fact, hold them in a place of honor in a number of ways. Not honor in the sense of considering them to be orthodoxy at all. In fact, in their minds, they weren't even real Jews, because they didn't worship so much in Jerusalem, but in their own communities. They had their own synagogues that were their places of worship. And they were on the other side of the spectrum from the Sadducees, who said there is no mystical truth, but only the literal social day-by-day relationships between men. The Essenes interpreted everything as having a mystical significance and a mystical purpose. But they were honored primarily because of the intensity of their belief and of their character. The Essenes had become the most educated people of the day, and in fact it would be most unusual to find a Jewess, a woman among the Jews, who could read or write, but Mary could, because she was trained by the Essenes, and only those girls who grew up in the Essene community were respected in the Jewish community as being worthy of teaching and training, of study and of learning to read and write. So the Essenes were thought of as the most excellent scholars. If a wealthy person had children and wanted them to have a great education, they hired an Essene tutor. Not only were they respected as scholars, they were respected for their honesty, for their impeccable honesty, to the extent that when there was a dispute among the people, they much preferred to have that dispute arbitrated by an Essene instead of by the courts. And so they were both held with honor and respect, and were considered to be the unorthodox, and were even called Gentiles often by the Orthodox Jews, because anyone who was not an Orthodox Jew was to their thinking a Gentile. So you have this rivalry between religious factions, and rivalry between those people who were Jewish in their heritage and their thought, and those people who were accommodating the Romans. There was, in fact, even a party of people who supported Herod and the family, and they were called Herodians. So you have groups of rebels, pockets of people with various different beliefs, bound only by the common heritage of living in a land, but living with a very palpable hatred for one another. And throughout the country, this undercurrent, not just of Jews for Romans, but of Pharisees for Sadducees, and of Pharisees and Sadducees for Samaritans, and of Samaritans for the Orthodoxy, and the Herodians for almost everybody. And the Samaritans supported Herod, and the Herodians supported Herod, but the Herodians did not support the Samaritans. And so it is in this kind of country, with all these pockets of intrigue, that Jesus is growing up seeing hatred and fear surrounding him on every hand, and being a much more strong and powerful influence than the quality of love and caring. And he was seeing the very law that should have liberated them, that should have made them free, that should have been their touch with truth. That law was being used as an instrument of hatred, and seemed to be more used in that direction than in bringing worth and love and acceptance of one another. So in this boiling cauldron of hatred, he began to grow up, and saw the teachings that were being established among the people in the north on the shores of Galilee. A great rabbi whose name was Hillel had established a school. And Rabbi Hillel was a Pharisee, but he was a new kind of Pharisee. He was a wise man, and a man so respected among the Jewish people that people would travel any distance to hear Hillel speak. There was another rabbi whose name was Shammai, who was the rival of Hillel, and the two of these rabbis were the most important religious figures of their day, apart from the high priest, and he was political anyway. Nobody really thought of him as a religious figure. It was Shammai and Hillel who were the religious leaders. And then, of course, in the background were all of these messiahs popping up here and there, at least one a year, all during this period of growth. And some of them quite sincere, probably, in their hope and their fervor. I mean, it was a place that boiled within the blood of the Jewish boys the dream that they might be the one to lead Israel out of bondage. There was every year a feast of Purim. It was the time of remembering the deliverance of the people of Israel in Persia, under the Persian Empire, from the sentence of death that was pronounced on the entire nation, essentially. When Queen Esther had persuaded the king of the worth, the value, and the importance of the Hebrew people, and the nation had been saved by her actions of love for her people and for the king. And this feast was celebrated every year in a fashion that might most closely resemble our Halloween. It was celebrated with the youngsters going from house to house and receiving treats, and with people coming together to celebrate and party. And it was much more a feast of celebration than one of great religious significance. It was sort of political significance. It was a 4th of July and a Halloween sort of rolled into one. And during one of these feasts, as the people got together, the people from Galilee, the people from Jordan, the people from Carmel, the people from Nazareth, all celebrating together, great friends together, there was a man from Capernaum named Zebedee, who said to the group, "Why don't we go this year down to Jerusalem for the feast of the Passover? We haven't been there in many years because of the political intrigue between the North and the South, and this might be our best chance to go there." I mean, it's a time when the political factions have eased their argumentation with one another, and we can make the trip more safely than we have been able to do in past years. Why don't we go down for the Passover? And everyone, of course, had dreamed for years and years of being able to visit Jerusalem and the temple and to be there for the time of Passover, and Jesus was more than delighted. He had come of age now and had celebrated his bar mitzvah, and his dream perhaps was more than anything else to sit on Solomon's porch and to listen to the rabbis arguing the finer points of the law. And so they traveled together, some of them going in advance to find quarters where the great group of pilgrims from Galilee could stay. And the youngsters, as they were playing around Jerusalem, failed to find Jesus among them because he went every day down to the temple again to hear the rabbis sitting and discussing. Here was Hillel with all of his followers around him, and each of the men, each of the students of Hillel, trying to outdo one another with the technicality of the questions that they could ask. Of course, not because they wanted answers, but because they wanted everybody else to notice how erudite were their questions. And Hillel must have been quite bored with responding to these most technical little ideas. And somebody would say, the law says that a man must separate himself from his wife during her period of uncleanness, and yet they live together in the same house. What do you say of this, Hillel? And he says to them, of course they must be separated, but doesn't the same passage of the Old Testament say that evil is separated from good just by a hedge of lilies? And if there is the separation between them, that is even so much as the suggestion of the lilies, the purity of her separates her from her husband, and so the law is satisfied in the consciousness of the two. And this was the new quality of thinking that had come into the Pharisees. The law is important, but the law is made to serve us. And as Jesus sat and listened to this man, he must have thought, that's the man I'd like to study with and like to learn some more of the law. And after he had returned day after day, and Hillel noticed this young boy that kept appearing, he became interested curious about this child who seemed more interested in these discussions than in play. These were adult men, they were scholars. They had given their life to the study of the law, and their argument was of fine points that largely didn't make a difference anyway. And one day, perhaps out of his boredom, Hillel turned to Jesus and said, "Who are you? Where are you from?" And he explained that he was from Galilee. You can almost see a smirk on Hillel's face at that, because there just aren't any scholars in Galilee. And he said, and how are you enjoying the discussions? Have you learned anything? "Oh, yes, I've learned quite a lot." Well, what have you learned? And more than what he had learned, perhaps he had a question. And the first question that he presented to Hillel was, "It is written that no teaching of any rabbi since the time of Moses is as important as the law itself. How is it then that all of the Pharisees are bound by the teachings of the rabbis who followed Moses as if these were laws unto themselves?" And Hillel thought for a moment, where is this kid coming from? And how in the world does he have the nerve to insult me? He is suggesting that what I am teaching is not as important as the law. He has challenged my authority. What kind of a child is this? And he responded to him that as the rabbis were attuned to the same force that had given the law, their interpretation of the Torah was assumed to come from the same source as the Torah, and so his teaching was not in addition or not an exception to the Torah, but rather a continuation of it, and thereby carried the same authority. Jesus didn't look convinced, and Hillel was even more concerned, and perhaps asked him a question. And his question perhaps suggested that there is a time when the Messiah might come, and that people of Galilee, and indeed the people among the Essenes, were suggesting that the Messiah might already be among us. And how might that be possible? He asked the youngster. And the youngster replied to him, "Did not David say in the Psalms, what? Know ye not? I have said, ye are gods, sons of the Most High." And so the youngster said, might it not be possible that you, or I, for that matter, might be the Messiah here in our midst? Might it not be any one of us who, having overcome the separation between God and man, who, having come to know who he really is, has eliminated all in him that is of Adam, and is only filled with that is the Son of God? Might the Messiah be here because of the consciousness of that individual? And Hillel was exasperated by the argument and said, would you have us believe that the Messiah might come from the common man? And Jesus replied, is it not also written that he is not comely that anyone would desire him? He will not be born a king that we would be attracted to him, and yet, even by his coming, a suffering servant. You have presented him as a crowned king, but has not Isaiah described him as one who has no beauty that we would desire him? Has he not suggested that he would be born among the common men? And the discussion went on and on and on, so that the scholars were gathered around watching this child confounding the great Rabbi Hillel, the founder of the greatest school of the Pharisees. And in the meantime, the group of people from Galilee had gathered together in their caravan, all of the children running along ahead, and the children being cared for by a few of the adults. There was an assumption that all of the children were playing together, and it was not until they had gone all the way to Hebron that Joseph and Mary found that their eldest son was not among them. And the caravan really couldn't stop. It had to go ahead and move from Jerusalem in their roundabout way up to Galilee. And Joseph and Mary had to leave their younger children to follow with the caravan and turn back and go all the way back to Jerusalem to find Jesus. And they were frightened. The idea of a 12-year-old boy being separated from the family, and they had gone almost a day's journey without even finding him, and had to spend the night without him. And where would they look for him? They went back to the place where they had stayed, and he was not there, and no one had word of him. And not knowing what else to do, they went up to the temple, and there the following day, sitting where he had been each day before, was Jesus, talking with Hillel and confounding the people gathered around him. And with great exasperation and concern, they came to him and said, "Why have you done this to us? Didn't you know that we would be worried?" And he smiled at them and said, "Didn't you know I would be about my Father's business?" He had become of majority now. He had passed his bar mitzvah. He was a man in his thinking. Why should I be following after my mommy and daddy on this caravan when this is where I want to be, talking about the things of God? And for goodness sake, I want to elevate this conversation from these tiny points of the law that don't matter to something of substance, that these people can hear and think in a new kind of way. And these doctors and arbitrators of the law had one comment about the manner in which he spoke. It was not as if he were a scholar and he had learned the fine points of the law, but he spoke as if he knew experientially what he was talking about. And they had never quite encountered anyone who knew experientially. They had only encountered scholars who knew from learning through the senses, from taking the words of others and being able to repeat them, and with their great intelligence could interpret them and could add to them. But somebody who spoke as if he had experienced what he's talking about, who spoke of God as if he knew him, like a personal friend. It was a new thought, a new idea. Hillel established his school on the shores of the Galilee and took this place where no scholar comes from and made it the central place of learning for the Pharisees and made it a sacred place. But as Jesus grew up, there developed that great rivalry between the school of Hillel in the north on the shores of Galilee and the high priest in Jerusalem, who was absolutely determined that this influence up there in Galilee had to be stopped. Somehow these teachers had to stop taking in the people into this new consciousness, almost a new religion that was bringing a consciousness of, if the spirit is right, the letter of the law is met. And this man who was determined to enforce the letter of the law had to kill this movement of spirit of the law. And so he invited the teachers, the masters of Hillel's school, to come down to Jerusalem for a banquet to honor them. Now, as long as they were in Galilee, they were essentially in a foreign country. There was a different tetrarch that was ruling that part of the country, and so he had no authority. His authority was limited to the area around Jerusalem, where he even had the authority to pronounce a death sentence on anyone who blasphemed, but he couldn't touch Hillel's school. And so, not being able to stop them, he made a conciliatory move. Let's get together and let's discuss these things. And the masters of the school thought it a delightful idea and journeyed down to Jerusalem to meet with their enemy, who, having them now on his home turf, where he had authority, pronounced upon all of them a death sentence. And so the teachers of Hillel's school were stoned, and the school on the shores of the Galilee was closed, and the movement that Jesus had inspired in this man as a child to enforce the spirit of the law instead of the letter of the law was essentially stamped out. And Jesus, from this point, became something of a fugitive, hunted. He had been a major influence in the school, had visited there, had studied, and now was forced to leave. And he took a trip again. He took a trip back to Egypt to meet with the masters of the school there, to visit the university in Alexandria, but more than that, to visit with the teachers near Cairo at Heliopolis. The new city of Cairo had already begun to develop, and it was there that he was questioned again by the masters of the school there, and through the questioning prepared for initiation. And he was taken up then, this teenager, possibly the youngest of those who had come into this great school of initiation, to take that final test. The test being the placing of the body into the tomb, the sepulcher, and to place the body in suspended animation and allow the soul to go out through the great shaft that pointed toward the North Star, and send his consciousness out into that source of light of the universe, and bring back then the stories of the understanding of the greater universe, the relationship of the macrocosm to the microcosm. The body then would be left sealed for 3 days, and the initiate was expected to be able to breathe back into it life with the help of the Hierophant, who would raise that body. And having survived this overcoming of the physical body by the consciousness, he then would be pronounced Egypt's highest initiate, or one of those. But this young initiate did something that had never been done before. They sealed his body in the tomb, and immediately following, they found him standing in the room with them, carrying on a discussion about what was going on, the body in the tomb, but another body, a light body, and a consciousness that could communicate with him, and the communication being very clear. Death has no power over me. And even the physical body being encased in this sepulcher is no limitation to me. And he had an ability to send his consciousness to the furthest reaches of the star and answer the questions that the Hierophants asked, but still to be present during the time. And it was not necessary to unseal the tomb for him to recover his body. He remade it right in their presence, even without the opening of the sepulcher, and revealed himself to have gone a step beyond even the highest initiation of Egypt. His cousin John had been initiated there and had understood the mysteries of Egypt, but it was time now for him to go beyond that, having passed that time of initiation and having begun to take the responsibility for teaching. He went to find a ship that would carry him back to Israel, perhaps to go up the coast and to travel by foot then to Galilee, to return and begin his ministry there. And as he went to try and find a ship at Alexandria, he went from one to another, there not being a ship available, until somebody said, there is a man who's from your area of the world anyway. He has a major business here, but he's Jewish, and from somewhere about your country, and perhaps he will have something traveling in that direction. Why don't you go down to his place and ask him? And he went down until he found the shipyard of Joseph of Arimathea, and asked if there might be a ship going north up the coast that he could get away back to Israel. And he had to wait, and he waited and waited, and during the wait they had conversations. He told them of his family heritage, of Miriam and of Joseph, and found in fact that Joseph of Arimathea was quite familiar with some of the people that he knew, Zebedee of Capernaum, and friends of his. And with this common heritage and with his ability as a carpenter, Joseph became convinced, this is a man that I want on my ship. Every ship has to have a good carpenter when they are going to make a major trip, and this man just might be handy. And so he took him aboard. But at the last minute, after Jesus had waited for weeks, perhaps even months, for the opportunity to sail, he said to him, the plans have been changed, and the things that we were going to carry to Israel are not available, and so our trip is going to take us considerably further. And Jesus said, but where? How much further? Where are we going to go, and how will I get to Israel? And he said, well, a little further up the coast. It will be a little bit longer journey, but we will return you to Israel, and why don't you sail with us? We have to pick up a load of tin, which was a precious commodity in the Middle East at the time. And he set about his journey in the ship. And they passed through the Mediterranean and went around the southern coast of Spain and up across the face of Europe, way beyond anything that Jesus ever considered that a young boy from Galilee might experience. And it was out into the waters of Atlantic that they were sailing along northward when the skies turned dark and the sea became suddenly rough, and one of those freak storms that people in that time dreaded most was coming toward them. And standing on the deck and looking out from the ship, one could see something in the distance that looked as if the horizon itself had elevated itself quite over the surface of the water. And fear set into the hearts of these hardened sailors who were almost never afraid. But as they realized that this coming wall coming from the horizon toward them was a wall of water, they all began to batten down the ship and make preparations, and they remembered prayers they hadn't thought of in years. But Jesus stood with these clouds coming overhead and the wind beginning to blow and the sound of the rush of this wall of water coming toward them, and basked in the majesty of the whole thing, absolutely delighted with the aliveness of the energy of the whole universe. Here is this great wall of water coming toward us, the sky expressing itself, the very power of God revealing itself into the whole of the earth, and he just soaked it up, enjoyed the whole experience until the sailors began to notice his response and wonder about the sanity of this man who seemed to just absorb energy from the whole thing rather than being frightened by it. And as the wall of water came closer, and fear had overtaken them, and many of them had gone below, and those who didn't had tied themselves to the decks so that they wouldn't be washed overboard, the roar of this coming closer and closer, and they began to beg. And they begged him, "Can't you make yourself safe? Can't you help us pray? Aren't you going to be a part of our begging God to do something about this?" And he realized the fear that was surrounding him in these people and felt compassion for them. And he turned to the great wall of water as if it were a pet. And he spoke to it and said, "Peace, be still." And it lay down at his feet like a puppy. And the water became as glass again. And they wondered, who do we have here? What kind of power, what kind of presence has this relationship with the universe? And Joseph looked at him and wondered and asked questions. And they continued to sail northward until they came to a strange place. The sailors themselves talked of this strange place. A land that nobody seems to know much about. The inhabitants are very different from anything that we have known, and their religion seems to have a great deal of power, but it is a bloodthirsty religion, and we're afraid of the people. And the sailors would stay with the ship and wouldn't even go ashore as they set into this Isle of Avalon. But Jesus, being the curious man that he was, and in fact responding to the need of Joseph to go into the country and find the shipment that should have been waiting there, was carried with him into the mines of Joseph of Arimathea near Glastonbury. And he met the people and learned of their human sacrifice and the hill at Avalon where these human sacrifices took place. And it became an opportunity for him to talk of a different kind, a different quality of sacrifice. He could understand their teaching, and understood that their tendency toward human sacrifice had in fact a basis in truth, that men listening to guidance of a supernatural force will be taught things that have a kernel of truth within them, but the application of them may be barbarian. And he attempted to explain to them the human sacrifice that you must make is the sacrifice of yourself as a human, to give yourself to the source that can bring light and life in you. And tradition says that he stopped the giving of a life on the top of the Tor that day, as he replaced the practice of the human sacrifice with a new quality of sacrifice. And had he not demonstrated his ability to heal and to stop the death of the sacrifice, they might not have believed him. But the abilities that he displayed among them had a profound effect on their religion and their religious practices long before the advent of Christianity into those isles. There were the stories of this man who came and changed the very basic nature of the expression of their religion. And he sailed again, came back to his own country, and spent a time among the people, seeing his family, knowing that his father had gone, and now his mother was a widow with the children, and his brother had taken up the practice of carpentry, his sister become married, and he joined himself again with his cousin John to a caravan, this time going toward the east. And he sat among the men of the east who talked of God inside, and he listened to the comparison between the truth that they were teaching and the truth that he had grown up with. And he discovered among these other people a teaching of a Messiah, but their teaching of the Messiah was quite different. It was a teaching that said that the seed of God is already, always inside us, and that giving our consciousness to that seed, we become that, so that we are transformed, and God living in us becomes revealed through us. And he talked of himself and his conviction that his nation, his people, had for centuries awaited the coming of the Messiah, and he had felt from the earliest days of his life that the Messiah has come. And he couldn't even bring himself to doubt that the Messiah had come, because he felt the presence of God inside him. And a man in whom God lives must be the Son of God. It is the Son of God in me that animates me, and I don't feel kin to the sons of men in the sense of being controlled by this body. And he knew from the very earliest day that his body didn't control him, that his body was his instrument to speak through, and that what did control and animate him was God inside him. And his argument had always been, am I not the Messiah if I am the expression of God within this body and within this world? Not that it stops anyone else from being the Messiah, and always he looked eagerly into the eyes of other people, trying to find that in them was the Messiah too. And here and there, one and another gave a glimmer of hope, but then it wasn't. There were those who could recognize the Messiah, and their eyes lit up with the recognition of him, and he could feel it in them, but they didn't quite come to the point that he experienced of knowing that's not only what I know about, it is not only what inspires me, it's what I am. And he began to attempt to try to share that concept, that idea with the people around him. If there is not alive in you anything that is of the control of the earth, if that is not your animating force, if that's not your life, if that's not your identity, but your identity is only that in you which gives life. If you are God in you, then you are the Messiah. And there is only one consciousness that is the Messiah, but can it not live in all of us, even as the psalmist had said, don't you know that you're gods and sons of the Most High? And one who is a son of the Most High is a Messiah. He has saved his life in his expression and has become the salvation of the people about him. He traveled back from the east to his land again and became aware it's time to begin to change the consciousness of the people from living in fear to living in love. And what I must do is not teach people, as Hillel did, how best to obey the law. It just doesn't work. His school was destroyed, his life was destroyed. I could teach them from now on that it's the spirit of the law and not the letter of the law that matters, but there has to be something more than that that I can teach them that will be transforming. And what has to go is that which separates us, and the separation is living in fear. If I can teach them that it is love that is the power behind the law, and if love for one another becomes more important than interpreting the law the same way, then we will erase these boundaries of fear and separation, and this law of love will allow us to perfectly obey the law, so that we don't have to be concerned with the details of interpretation, but we can live with a new consciousness, a new law, so that the law is obeyed by our new consciousness, need not be studied and interpreted in that sense, but the love that we begin to experience and express among us will erase those lines of argument and separation and the necessity to feel that we must kill or destroy one another and must rule over one another. If I can teach love, I will have taught the law and will allow people to begin to experience the living love inside them that will plant the Christ in their hearts, as it is in my heart, and will begin to make them what I am. And so he walked among his people and began to express. He expressed to his cousin, it's time for me to begin. And I want to teach people not just what you and I were taught in the schools, but I want instead to try to make them what I am. And John said to him, I can teach them about it. I can show them how to do it. But you have so become it that there's not a doubt in you. I wish I could have what you have. And I want to become what you are and help the people to become that. And he established the teaching of the Essenes just north of the community, just where the Jordan moves into the Dead Sea. He gathered people together to baptize them. And no longer was he hunted like an animal, but became a strong voice that spoke out against Herod and actually tried to make him responsible for his actions. And speaking out boldly, he told the people, you can change your very nature by allowing a new life to be born in you. I can tell you about this life, and you can have it living in you, but most of all, I want you to know this life living in a man so perfectly that what I would like to give you, he is. Not just he has it, but he is it, the embodiment of what you would like to have alive in you and what I have alive in me. And he told them, he's coming, make yourself ready. Have alive in you what you would recognize in him, and as they began to be born by this commitment to love, so he appeared. And John said, there he is, the Lamb of God. He's come to take away your sin, your failure, your separation, and he has the keys for doing so. Listen to him, follow him. And the very people who had been following John for so long, his disciples, the disciples of this great guru, turned in mass and began to follow the other man. And there, in doing that, John had done what teachers throughout centuries have been unable to do, to allow their followers to turn from them because of such a lack of ego, such a lack of need for power. He could introduce them to the Christ and watch his support go the other way and become the followers of this man who could give them more. And so the introducer of the teacher became one who had expressed the lack of ego, so much without self that a greater self could come to inhabit him. And in pointing the people to the Christ and away from himself, he made that last step that allowed him to become what Christ was. His life ended then. He had passed the final initiation and had left the work to this man who was the embodiment of the consciousness of God. And as the people began to follow him then, he looked around him at the kinds of people. There were here the Herodians, the rebels, the zealots, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the traitors, and the prostitutes, and all of them, people who seemed incapable of loving one another. And he thought, if I'm going to teach love, then the people that I must gather to me are the least loving people that I could find. And he took first a group of fishermen, people who were known for their coarseness and for their manhood. And they were interested in the Messiah, of course, but their only real interest in the Messiah was to get rid of the hated Romans. So even their motivation in seeking a Messiah was a motivation of hate, of anger, and of fear. But he went to them and he spoke to them in a way that caused their fear and their anger to turn into something like confidence and love. And he made so much sense as he spoke, and probably wasn't his words at all. But when his eyes met their eyes, they felt as if here are the eyes of a man who can look right through my eyes as if they're windows and see everything that I ever thought and tell me. And feeling naked and opened and revealed and seeing in him something that they'd never seen in a man before, they were drawn like a magnet to him. And Andrew listened to him teach, and tied to that teaching and thrilled by finding the Messiah, the man who's finally going to lead us away from Rome, he thought, the man that I want most to be with him is my big brother Peter, the really powerful one who rules all of the fishermen of Galilee. If you want to fish in the Galilee, you're going to have to get Peter's permission, because he runs Peter's mafia around the area of Capernaum. This strong man that is reputed to rule the whole waterfront is a man who is looking to get rid of Romans, and if a Messiah needs a right-hand man, that's the man he needs. That's the guy that can take care of the battles. So he runs down to get Peter, and he says to him, "I've found the Messiah." And Peter said, "Again?" I mean, last week it was John ben Zechariah, the baptizer. You were telling me all about him, and now you've found somebody else. Don't you know I'm not given to following gurus? That's your trip. You go with him. Leave me alone. But he's saying this time, look, this is different. I've never seen a man like this. You've got to see what he's doing. This is an incredible being. Just come with me and just see him just once. And Peter turned to his fishermen and said, "I'll be back in a few minutes. This won't take long. Just go ahead and mend your nets without me." And he turns and walks away with Andrew, and they come to this man who's sitting on a rock in a gathering of people, not very impressive. A handful of people are listening to him. But they take their seat and they listen. And it takes only a moment before Peter is seated and the eyes of the man meet his eyes, and he's stunned. That man just looked at me as if he has known me all my life. And something in his look tells me that he understands what's happening in my heart. And I wish that what he saw in me weren't in there. And this big, burly man tried to become very small as he sort of caved in and attempted to fade in the background, and wished that this teacher wouldn't look at him anymore, even though he was fascinated with what the man was saying. And as he sat, he noticed a very regal kind of figure approaching, the very kind of man that Peter liked least of all of the Jews. Happened to be the kind of man who worshipped in the temple, and everybody knew it. He was one of these people who was there at every Passover. And he wore the fur hat of the rabbi, and was obviously a man of means, because he had ermine-lined robes, and his hair was worn in the manner of the Greeks of the day that was so fashionable. It was carefully curled and marcelled. and even his fingernails was clean, and there was nothing more disgusting than that to Peter. And so this regal man approached, and the teacher stopped in his teaching and looked up at him, and he said, "Well, look at this." Peter liked him even more. And he said to this regal man approaching, "What have we here? A Hebrew in whom there is absolutely no guile." And he implied to him, "I'm impressed," which of course was the reason that he dressed that way. It was his intention to impress people. And Nathanael drew himself up straight and tall and said, "And what is it that you actually know of me? I mean, you can't know who I am." And Jesus said, "Well, I knew that when your buddy there went to fetch you to come and listen to me, you were sitting under a tree and you were reading from the book of Daniel, and you were on the 3rd chapter. His curls went limp. He looked at the teacher and he said, "Truly, you must be the Son of God," as Philip said. And Jesus had himself a nice chuckle at that one, and he said, "All I've done is give you this little display that I might be a little psychic, and already you're ready to believe that I'm the Son of God. How easily you're impressed. Just wait until you see me open up heaven and angels coming up and down on ladders." Well, some of the starch was taken out of Nathanael, and he sat down, willing now to listen. Didn't particularly like the company. I mean, there's Peter over there, one of those fishermen, smells of fish. I'm not sure that I want to be seen in his company, but this man is so fascinating as he unfolds the law that I have memorized, every word of the Torah committed to heart, and all of the Targums, all of the interpretations, the teachings of Hillel, the teachings of Shammai. I know them all. I can explain the letter of the law with the best of them. But this man explains things that I don't know. It goes beyond the information that I've received. And he had to listen. And so here was the opportunity for Jesus. Peter would never be seen with this guy, and this guy would even less ever be seen with Peter. But he took the two of them and he said, "Okay, let's go together and let's have a meal together." And Nathanael thought, "Do we have to take him?" And Peter was thinking, what if my fisherman buddies see me with this dude with curled hair yet? But Jesus was determined that these two should love one another. And so he took them down to the waterfront where there was a booth. It was a customs booth. When people came ashore in Capernaum, they had to pay a tax. And in fact, they had to have their money changed because the people disdained to use Roman coins. There were special coins minted for Israel. Now, that was not done anywhere else in the Roman Empire, but these crazy Jews would not spend coins that had an image of Caesar on them, so they simply wouldn't use Roman coins. So there were special Israeli coins that were minted just for them. But when they came to pay tax, when they got off the boat, they had to change their Israeli coins for Roman coins. Now, they didn't know the value of the Roman coins. They never spent them. But they had to use them to pay tax. And this fellow in the booth was a Jew, but he worked for Rome, and he took taxes from the Jews, and knowing that they didn't know the value of the Roman money, he could change them the way that he wanted to, and he had a regular practice of shortchanging them. And he was such a stickler for details that he always kept records of exactly how much he shortchanged them. So he was very good at attention to details, but not very long on honesty, and was probably the most unpopular person in all of Galilee. There was only one thing that a Galilean Jew hated more than a Roman, and that was a Jew who would work for a Roman against Jews. The most hated man of all was there in that booth, and they went down expecting to have lunch with Jesus, and he stops to talk with the man in the booth, and they think, what's he going to change money for? And he speaks to this fellow and he says, "How would you like to have lunch with us?" And Peter choked. And Nathanael looked around for something else to do. And they couldn't believe. I mean, he's not serious. I mean, going to lunch with this guy could get you stoned. We could be killed for even talking with this man in a friendly conversation. I mean, we pass our money and we don't say a word, and we receive his money with distaste, and we don't even handle it any longer than we have to. I mean, we don't touch people like this. And he's talking about having lunch with him. And this man in the booth is looking at Jesus and wondering, what kind of a Jew are you asking to have lunch with me? The man had piled up money, had lots of it, had influence, lots of it, but hadn't had a friend in years and years and years. People didn't speak to him. He had to sit alone at night with his money and his possessions, guard his house. But the only person that he could be friendly with were the Romans who employed him, and he was absolutely isolated from the Jewish people. But here's a rabbi who spoke kindly to me. There's something that emanates from him, an acceptance of me, as if I'm all right. And he felt it, and he said to the rabbi, "I really do want to have a meal with you, but there's something I have to do first." And Jesus understood. And he said, "Go and do it, and do it quickly." And so the tax collector shut down his booth and took his little notepad that showed everyone that he had ever shortchanged, and he went home quickly and began to sell his furniture and his lalique vases and his balik crystal and his Wedgwood collection. And he took the money from turning these things into cash and went all over the community trying to return the money that he had taken from people unfairly, and attempted even to give them more in return than he had stolen from them. And feeling thus cleansed, he went for his dinner date. And they said, "And where shall we eat together?" Now, by now, Nathanael and Peter are still wondering, we don't really want to be seen with this guy, but maybe, if he wants to sit and have lunch with him, maybe we can be close enough where we can hear what's going on without actually participating in this meal, because I don't want to miss the word that he has to say. But when Matthew says, "Where are we going to eat?" Jesus says, "Why don't we eat at your house?" And Peter's thinking, oh my, they're going to go inside his house, and I have to be seen entering that house. I mean, it keeps going from bad to worse. What kind of a guy is this? I thought he was going to lead us out of the captivity of Rome, and here he is consorting with traitors. Oh, that's it. He's going to get secret information. This guy is really clever. Okay, now we've got it. Let's all go and have dinner with Matthew, and we'll find out all the Roman secrets. And filled with intrigue, they all go to dinner. And they have this wonderful conversation about love. Peter didn't know much about love, but it began to make sense. If I have love for myself, for God, and for others, and if loving my brother means loving everyone, I mean, according to this man, the whole world is my brother, and I can no longer love Orthodox Jews and hate Pharisees and hate Sadducees and hate Romans and hate tax collectors and keep the law. This man is telling me I'm actually violating the law by what I thought was keeping the letter of the law. His head was spinning and new thinking was coming when Jesus took the whole group of them now, and not only did they have dinner with Matthew, but Jesus said to Matthew, "Look, close down your business and take the money that you have left and travel with us. We've got a work to do. We've got an army to build. We have to create a new kingdom, the kingdom of God in this place." And he took them out until they found some Herodians. Who else? And then they found some zealots who hate Herodians. And then they found a man from way down south who was into publicity, public relations, doing things right, impressing the court of the king. And this man did them the favor of joining their group. They all hated his ego, among other things. And so he had gathered himself together now 12 men, each of whom hated everybody else in the group when they joined the group, and the entire group hated each one of them. And he took them out to live with each other and to learn to love and accept one another. And this was his mission. If I can take these 12 men, all of whom hate and envy and compete with one another, and teach them the law of love, then perhaps these men, becoming the embodiment of love, can give love to the people. And having gathered them together and they're beginning to at least tolerate one another, he travels with them down to Jerusalem. Jerusalem, it seems, had its counterpart of Times Square, where the massage parlors were. And they sat down at a little falafel joint next to massage parlor, and saw a lady of the evening leaning up against the door of the place, and he sat there with them, teaching them the things of love as she was overhearing, until she recognized that the divine lover, the adulterous woman that he talked about in his story, in his sermon, was her. When he spoke of the original lover, when he spoke of the adulterous woman that remembered in the back of her mind that there was a prince, her first lover, she understood somehow at heart level and thought, this is like me, and who is he? Isn't he the embodiment of that very one that he speaks of? She went to him. She fell down at his feet. And she cried, and her tears fell on his feet. And she used her long hair to dry his feet, and some ointment, costly ointment that had perhaps been bought for her by one of the Roman consorts that she had dated. But she poured this expensive perfume on his feet. And Judas sat there very uncomfortable and punched him with his elbow and said, don't you know what you're doing? I mean, don't you know what she is? I mean, we shouldn't even be in this place. I mean, you're building a kingdom. You've got to impress the right people. You've got to be seen with the right people. What if people see you with her? I mean, you can't afford to do this kind of thing in public. Look at the scene that she's making over your feet. And you know what people are going to think that we're doing in this area of Jerusalem. We shouldn't even be down here. But Jesus turned to him and he said, aren't you aware it's people like her that I came for? I mean, do the people who are not sick need a physician? If I'm a physician, I come to those who most need me. Who else? Do I really want to be seen with the high priest? He doesn't know that he's sick, and so he isn't going to call for the advice of a physician. She has recognized her need, and in recognizing her need, she has recognized me. She knows who I am. And her recognition of who I am has given her new consciousness, new life. And she became a part of that group that followed. And he spent his time then teaching them to love one another, teaching them to love the world. And the attitude that began as rebels attempting to revolutionize Israel became people committed to the law of love. And they listened and shared his one central teaching. The law is not done away with, but what I want to say to you is a new way of understanding the law. If you love God, yourself, and others equally, the law will take care of itself. And that one commandment is all you need, the law of love. And he traveled with them and taught them and demonstrated to them his ability to affect bodies, mind, consciousness, the weather, the earth, plants, all of the things about the environment. And at each step he would say, I am the Son of Man. My body was given birth to physically like all the rest of you, and the Son of Man can do nothing of himself, but the Father, the source of himself inside. The Father does the work. And the source from which I come is the source of yourself. And as he is in me, you've come to know me, and I live in you, don't I? I mean, you've come to know me and you've taken me into your heart. He lives in me, I live in you. The things that he does through me, he can do through you. And greater things than these. Then he said to them, there's a time of graduation. They came together to eat together, and he washed their feet. And he said to them, up to now, you've called me master, and I've been your master. And I've called you servants, and it's right. You were servants, serving me in my cause. But now I want to change that. I want to serve you, and after I become the servant, then you and I will be friends. And Peter said to him, I don't want to change this relationship. I'll not allow you to be my servant. I must serve you. I can't let you wash my feet. And the master said to him, but if I don't, then the relationship with me will not be whole, will not build the kingdom. You can't have even a part of my kingdom if we haven't taken this other step of responsibility. By being my servant, you can be irresponsible and leave the work to me. But if I become your servant and you use the power that is alive in me to do the same works that I have done, then you've taken that other step of responsibility that builds the kingdom. And if we can't take that step, then you have no part of me. And Peter said, don't stop with washing my feet, wash my hands and my head as well. And so he became their servant, as he had been all along, though they hadn't recognized it. The master is always the servant. The master has no need of a servant, but the servant needs the master to serve his need. And so he demonstrated to them the reversal of that situation. Then he said, okay, fellows, the kingdom is built. I've done what I came to do, and I'm going to leave now. And they looked puzzled. I thought we were going to liberate the country, that we were going to liberate the whole world. I mean, we've just started. What do you mean we were going to leave? And he said, well, you know, I came just to organize the trip. You fellows are supposed to do it. They were in a state of shock. What are you talking about? You have the words of eternal life. You have the ability to cause this. And he said, I suspected that you might respond that way, and in fact, that's why I'm leaving. If I don't leave, you fellows will never get about the business of building this kingdom. You'll leave it for me to do. I'm going to leave so that you can recognize who you really are. He said to them, in essence, if I stay here, then you will think of me as the Christ, but you won't think of yourselves as the Christ. But if I leave, you have to become the Christ, or Christ won't be here. So I make that your responsibility. I leave, and you become what I am. And everything that I've done, you become responsible for doing. And what I've done is just the beginning. You must do greater than I have done. I give that responsibility to you. And so he left. And after he had left, they all felt inadequate. They remembered him and they talked about him, but they didn't know quite what to do. The fishermen went back to fishing, and the other people went back to other pursuits. Nobody went out to build the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus waited a little period of time, gave them an opportunity to make their decision, and then he came back for one last class. And he found Peter out there in the boat again, fishing like he always had. And he stood on the bank and he looked for a bit. Peter had gone through a really rough time. I mean, he had left a few years ago telling these fellows, I'll be back in a few minutes. And 3 years later, he had returned, and he returned with this feeling that it hadn't worked. This man that I thought was the Messiah, this man that I served as the Messiah, he's been crucified. It's all over. There's no power in our movement. Israel isn't going to be liberated. The only thing I can do is go back to fishing. He went with a very hurting and heavy heart, but as he walked down to take control of his boat again, he was probably thinking, I just dare any one of these guys to say anything about it. And they didn't. They saw the feeling, and they left him hurt, disappointed, and back at fishing. And so much wanting what he had believed to be true, that in his imagination, anyone he saw almost could be, when someone has died and gone, it's hard to believe. And I sort of expect to see them walking up again any moment. And so he was like that. Kept looking for them, and somebody on the bank looked an awful lot like him. He dared not believe it, didn't want to believe it. He had to be resigned to the truth. He's gone. But that fellow on the bank, strange, he's waving at me. And he looks just like the master. What is it that he's saying? You haven't caught any fish all night? What is this guy, making fun of me? Why don't you cast your nets on the other side of the boat? What's this crazy fool who doesn't know anything about fishing? We always put our nets on this side of the boat. Go ahead, put your nets on the other side of the boat. Try it once. Well, what the heck? They threw their nets on the other side of the boat and caught so many fish that the net broke. And he looked again. That guy has a sense of humor, just like the master. Gotta be him. Nobody else could have set me up like that. And he couldn't wait for the boat to get to shore. He just went overboard and swam. And sure enough, there was the master sitting on the shore. He hadn't caught it. Peter hadn't caught any fish all night, but there was the master cooking fish. Now, how did he do that? Peter didn't bother asking anymore. He just sat down with him for breakfast. And Jesus said, listen, Peter, I want you to gather all the fellows together. We're going to have a reunion. But what I want you to do is, all of you fellows, gather there where we had supper that night. And all I want you to do is sit and wait. And I'll come back. Not me, not physically, but you know the spirit that is alive in me. You know what I am, and the way that you know what I am is to know the spirit that works through me. That's how you recognize me for being me. That spirit that's in me. I'll send that spirit to be with you, and all you do is sit and wait until the spirit is there, and it will tell you what to do. So you go and you sit and you wait. He gathered them together, and they sat and they waited. And however much they were trained in meditation, I can't imagine that they sat there blissed out with their eyes rolled back in their head and their fingers just so. It was more a situation of sitting on the edge of their seats. Where is he? He's going to be here any second now. Something is going to happen. He had built into them a sense of expectancy. Something is going to happen as we sit and wait, and they are anticipating it. And it was the anticipation itself that opened them to the presence that did come. And Peter began to think, you know, I feel as if he's here. I feel the way that we always felt when he was with us. I feel that way now. But somehow it's different. We used to always feel him there or there, but he doesn't feel like out there anymore. It's like I feel him as if he were here in me. And then something went off like a skyrocket inside him. That's what he said it would be. His spirit would be in me. It's happened. He's alive. And he's in here. He's not out there anymore. And something in him erupted like fire. And the fire was on everybody, and he began to talk. But he had never been able to talk before. When Jesus tried to talk with him, he always grunted. And he punched Andrew, and he told Andrew, tell him whatever. He made Andrew ask all the questions. He made Andrew do all the talking. This big burly fisherman could do anything but talk, and now his mouth is running. And out of his mouth is pouring the same kind of thing that Jesus always said. And he realized he's alive. But he's more alive than he was before, because he's alive in me, and he's alive in Andrew, and he's alive in John. He's alive in all of us. It's like they took away one body and now he has 12 or more. But he's still alive, and I know him, and he's with us, and everything that he did before he can still do. And it was the Sabbath. It was time to go to worship. And they went down together to the temple, still celebrating as if they were drunk with new wine. And as they came to the gate of the temple, they saw a man lying there, begging. The same man had been there for years and years, and everyone knew that he had been unable to walk since birth 40 years ago. And Peter reached in his pocket just by habit to pull out a coin to give to the man, because no Jew would think of going into worship without giving alms. It was part of worship. But when he reached in his pocket, he realized, oh no, I don't have a coin. I have nothing to give to this man. And then he thought, that's not really what I want to give him anyway. What if I could give him what I've got? If I could give him what's alive in me, that's what I really want to give. And so he reached out to the man and he said, silver and gold, I have none. The man's looking disappointed already. But he said, what I do have, I want to give to you. Through the life of Christ, get up and walk. And he took his hand and lifted him up to his feet. And the man, stunned and startled, looking down, standing on his own 2 feet for the first time, neglected to walk. He ran. And he jumped. And he danced, and he made a lot of noise, and the people were pouring into Solomon's porch, going on their way into the temple, and the great rabbis were sitting there nitpicking the law as they had for years and years and years, and the students are sitting around, and Peter had always envied these great doctors of the law who could pick apart these delicate fine points, and always wanted to study with them, and knew that, of course, unless a man had credentials, it was illegal to do the teaching there. So he had never spent much time on Solomon's porch, a little here and there when he had the opportunity. Here's this man causing a ruckus, and all of these people listening to the doctors of the law are turned around looking at this man walking and wondering what in the world happened. And they're asking, who did this? How did this happen to you? And this man is pointing to the two of them. And here are Peter and John innocently walking into Solomon's porch, and a crowd of people are gathering around them. What did you do? How did you do it? And Peter was hoping they'd ask. And he found himself saying, you remember the Christ, you remember Jesus who was crucified just 5 weeks ago? Well, you thought you got rid of him, but you didn't get rid of him. He's alive now. He lives in me. He's the one that did this. I didn't do it. I couldn't do anything of myself. And he's recognizing Jesus' words coming out of his own mouth. I can do nothing of myself, but he who lives within me, he does the work, and he has done this. And suddenly he thought, I'm in Solomon's porch, and I'm teaching, and that's illegal. And here come the cops. And he got arrested. And they carried him away into their interrogation rooms in the temple and said, by what authority are you teaching? And they realized if these fellows cause another commotion and get a lot of people following him, they'll go up the road and build another temple, and everybody will go there and we'll go broke. And they were absolutely determined that that wasn't going to happen. So they were saying, what's going on? Where did you get this authority? And he recognized them. He recognized them especially because one very embarrassing night he had promised Jesus that he would stick by him forever and never betray him. But one night he had denied that he even knew him. And he had lived with the guilt and the hurt of that ever since. Not only the guilt, but the feeling of cowardness and worthlessness. And here was one of the men that he had said it to. And this man was questioning him now, and he had always wanted a chance to stand up, to make up for the time when he didn't. And this man calls the other priests together and says, you know, the big ugly one that's talking so much, all we have to do is threaten him. He's a coward. The night that Jesus died, he denied that he even knew him. And I know that he's a coward. So it went back to him and said, if you guys don't stop this, you'll get just what Jesus got. And they never should have said that. Because that turned him on, and he said to them, if you can't do any worse to me than you did to Jesus, do it right now, because you took one life and multiplied it by 12. And if that could happen to me, I'd have 12 mouths to talk with instead of one. And this one is not going to stop running because I couldn't anyway. I'm full of it, and it's coming out of me, and I can't stop it any more than you can. He tried to have a revival meeting in their interrogation room, and they didn't appreciate it. But now he had love. He was filled with life. It was the life of Christ, and he had finally understood the message of the Christ. He is alive if he is alive in me. And if he is alive in me and I am what he is, then I am Christ. And I am is the name of God. When I am God, I am Christ, and Christ lives. Thank you. There are some people who had some questions. It's late, but we'll take just a few questions. And one of the questions that already has been asked is about the Immaculate Conception. And there are just a couple of things that I would like to say about that. There are two important points about it. One is the reason. If Jesus wanted to be what we are and allow us to know that we have the same heritage, that we can be Christ as he was the Christ, then why would he set himself up for this special birth that would set him apart? I mean, we can use as an excuse for not being what he said we are, we can say, well, he was virgin born. I'm certainly not. He had this quality of difference that allowed him something that I don't have. What is the purpose or the meaning of the virgin birth or the Immaculate Conception? And there are two important points about it. One is that the Christ that matters to me is the Christ that is born in me. I can make of my heart, myself, my consciousness, a great temple, and it is likely that the ego will live inside it. Or I can make of myself a stable, recognizing that the I am that I have identified with up to now is the animal in the stable. And the place where I have fed myself is the manger that feeds the animal. If I can give my motivation, my identification from that nature to the birth of the Christ in me, then I will be transformed by it. He will be born in me and will live. That matters, not necessarily the historical story, except as an illustration of what can happen in me. Now, the consciousness that is born in me and will be my spiritual experience is either born as a result of descriptions of people who have given me doctrine and dogma. If my Sunday school teachers have caused this presence to be born in me, then the Sunday school teachers are the father of the child that is born in me. If, on the other hand, I have no preference, no description, no doctrine, no dogma, I do not impose on him what he must be. I mean, you must be a Baptist God, you must be a Catholic God, you must believe in reincarnation in order to be born in me. If I don't put any of those restrictions on it, but I say instead, I don't know who you are, I have no preferences, I have no alternate lovers, I make myself empty, virginal in consciousness, then the Christ that is planted in me is planted directly by my relationship with my source and is God's child, not the child of my teachers, not the child of my religion, not the child of my preferences or prejudices or ideas, but born of God himself. The Virgin has given birth to a child. I think as far as the historical part of the story is concerned, I think it is important for us to know that the first man ever born on this planet was born because the life that is God entered into the biological process that allows plants and animals to be born. The very first man that appeared on the planet was born of God breathing himself into that life. And so again, the man who became the demonstration of God's ability was born in that same way. God breathing life into a virgin, born of woman, but born of the consciousness of God activating life within the womb without the necessity of biological process giving birth to an animal nature that would be filled with God. But the demonstration is still the same. I am virgin born, in the sense that that which is life in me did not come from my father. That which is life in my body didn't come from my mother. What they gave was a biological process that made a vehicle that was available. Had not God breathed into it himself, I would not be alive. And if I know that what God breathed in is light and life, and the light and life is that which enlivens every man that comes into the world, if I recognize that that is God in me, and I am not that which was born of my parents, I am that which is breathed into what was born of my parents, then changing that identity from result to cause, I become virgin born and the Christ. And that's what the teaching is all about. Now, are there other questions?
Jesus said, be perfect and love yourself and accept yourself. It seems pursuing the ideal of perfection can create a lot of guilt. How do you reconcile those two? How do you accept the bad parts without indulging them?
I think that the best comparison to spiritual growth is to watch a baby growing. A baby could, of course, when he's learning to walk, become so freaked out by falling down again and again and again, he could in fact feel guilty about it. I am not doing what my parents are encouraging me to do. I'm failing every time I get up and walk. And besides that, it hurts. And so he can sit and not get up anymore if he wants. And he can become convinced, I can't do it. After all, I tried and it didn't work. And I think that I think it's probably true that if babies were born with adult consciousness, they never would be able to walk or to talk. Because as adults, they would become so convinced that that language is so hard, I've tried it and it won't work. Fortunately, children are born so naive that they don't know that they can't do what they subsequently do. And so is our... Thanks, kid. You want to come up here? Show off. I think the first thing that we need to recognize is that we have peculiar ideas of what is perfect and imperfect. And I think that might take care of the idea of guilt. First of all, we say that there are bodies that are born beautiful and strong and healthy, and that is perfect. But there are bodies that are born with congenital illness, brain damage, cripple, or whatever. And in order to understand perfection, we must understand that when I build a body, I build it custom built. And if I build into it crippled legs, that will cause my life to respond to the conditions that I've built into my body in a particular way. If I have deliberately built those legs that way, then what society is calling imperfect in me is nothing more than expression of my perfection. I don't believe that there is any such thing as an imperfect body. It is custom designed to the soul that will live in it, regardless of how it was built. And so is our experience of growing up. I mean, God knows the nature that He put in man, and He knows that that nature is one of making mistakes, failing, being frustrated, guilty, and all the rest, and all of that is a part of growth. And in order to understand the perfection that we must be, perhaps we need to ask the question, if I'm a child God, growing up to be what my Father is. What is a perfect child? Is a perfect child one who never gets dirty, one who never misbehaves, one who's never mean or hurt or angry or sad or whatever? A child who is so well behaved that he never does any of those things is not a perfect child, he's a neurotic child. A perfect child makes mistakes. He is mean sometimes, angry sometimes, hurt sometimes. All of those things, that is part of perfection. So does a perfect adult. A perfect adult is one who has tuned his commitment and his purpose to the Father's will and grows through the stages of making mistakes. And part of the perfection is in making the mistake and realizing that didn't work in my own best interest, and so I work to a new step. If I get hung up on that mistake and beat myself with guilt, I make myself a victim of that mistake, and I stay at that stage of growth. So perfection is growing as I should grow. Lack of perfection is getting so hung up on guilt that I stop the growth process.
In another sense, would you say, to follow up this question, would you say that perfection is basically in terms of our perception of who we are? In other words, if I perceive myself as I am, and therefore I am perfect, and if I don't look at myself as good or bad, then I just am in process.
Yes, I think that's perfection in growth. I think there is also an end product in the sense that Christ was the perfect manifestation of God on earth. I think that we cannot, through any explanation, excuse ourselves not being that as well. I think there is a point of perfection that we are intended to reach. However, there's a difference between a perfect child, perfect adolescent, and a perfect adult. And being an adult is not better than being a child. While I am a child, I make mistakes, and I am still perfect. As I am growing to the eventual perfection that is the perfect expression of God that I will become, I am still perfect along the way, even while making mistakes. But I am perfect for that stage of growth. Okay.
I just don't understand the crucifixion, Paul. I guess what I don't understand is, well, I realize that Jesus was the Lamb of God, and he symbolized the animal sacrifice that had been made. But what I don't understand, I guess, is the idea of blood sacrifice for sin, and why was crucifixion as the form of death chosen?
Well, I'm not sure that that crucifixion as the form of death is as important as the overcoming of death. It is an important symbol, but it is not that important as a symbol that it had to be crucifixion, except to fulfill the prophecy. And I think to look at that as being the important factor would cause us to miss the point. The more important point is that growth into the consciousness that he is demonstrating to us. The most important thing that he can demonstrate to us is liberation from the mark of the beast. That's what he wanted to communicate. The mark of the beast is the body's ability, the beast's ability, to dictate to me what I think, what I feel, what I do. And I'm only liberated from that if it is destroyed and I give it new life. It's destroyed, I still live. And as I reanimate that, I have power over it. Instead of it giving me life, I have given it life. And by resurrecting or rebuilding earth, by rebuilding the temple, He became the expression of rulership over the temple, and he opened a step that nobody had opened for us. And that's what it means. He died for our benefit. He opened a door that hadn't been opened before in our consciousness, in our recognition of our right relationship with the body. A person who takes our consciousness a step that it hasn't been before, gives us that step, that ability to make that step. And so he said, through that door, you will become what I am, and you are not what I am until you have overcome death and the physical, until you become the cause that produces the result. You are still a victim.
In other words, it was to liberate us from the idea that we had always had that we were controlled by the body and we were controlled by death rather than the other way around. Is that what you're
Well,
saying?
yes, to liberate us not only from the idea but from the reality of our experience. We had experienced that as reality. As to the form itself, there is particular significance in maybe it's illustrated in this way. When Israel was infested with serpents, there were serpents all over the ground. They were biting the people, and the people were dying. And in order to take people through that, in order to liberate them from the death that was coming from the serpent, Moses made a brass model of a serpent, put it up on a pole, and elevated it. Now, this must be the hardest thing in the world for a person to do. What they had to do in order to be liberated from the serpents that were killing them is they had to look up at that serpent on the pole. Now, that meant if I'm looking up there and have my eyes up there, I can't look at what I'm stepping on down here. And that consciousness that lifted their eyes to that and allowed that to take care of the danger that they walked in, allowed their consciousness to go beyond the concrete mind thinking, I'll take care of this by stepping in the right place. They depended no longer on their result mind, the result consciousness, but on God consciousness. They had to depend on higher consciousness to protect them on earth. And it was Jesus who said, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. And as I am lifted up, I will call all men to me. If their eyes are on me, then they are not stepping on that which threatens them there. By lifting our consciousness to that sacrifice, we think we make a sacrifice, but we are actually saved from the sacrifice by that faith that takes our dependence away from ego and to its source.
So that's what that means. Okay,
Must be.
thank you.
I've run across the idea in a few different sources. The idea that theoretically we could all be Christed, but there seem to be saying the possibility that Jesus is the only one who attained the level that he did, and that the rest of us can reach a high level, but that we can't reach the level that he did. Is it realistically possible that eventually we all will? Here, I have heard that you have to wait the other times, other planets, we all have that special incarnation that we will be Christ.
Well, one of the two things has to be true. Either we can be all that Christ was and more, or Christ was a liar. And if he was a liar, it's not going to be hard to surpass him. I think we better stop there. It's almost 11 o'clock. We'll see you tomorrow night, and we'll talk about Revelation then.
volvemos. Yeah? Okay. Okay. How are you?
I'm fine,
How is your name?
Luisa Echavarría.
Oh, doña Luisa Echevarría. Podemos hablar en español, ¿cierto?
Sí.
Por supuesto.
Mi Colombia era colombiana de Medellín.
¿Ah, sí? ¿Y ahora se fue? Está en
Pues,
Colombia.
Se murió.
Oh, se murió. Okay. Queremos hablar con usted. This is a bilingual program, this is for cable television. Y queremos mostrarle a los televidentes ese bello collar que usted tiene. ¿Nos puede decir algo sobre ese collar?
Sí, es de Tairano,
Ajá.
es hecho de Tumaga. Y mi esposo y la hija de él me lo compró hace unos 5 años buscándolo en todas partes y me regalaron. Y estoy feliz con mi
Collar.
collar.
Ajá. Where do you live?
En New York City, en Manhattan.
Entonces, you are a Colombian daughter, ¿no? By adoption?
I'm a Colombian by adoption.
And what do you like more about Colombia?
Oh, I love the people.
People?
I love to go to Colombia. We go every summer. We go to Bogotá, Medellín, Cartagena. And I love Cartagena very much. I love the climate of Medellín.
What do you like more of this presentation of the Colombian, La Leyenda del Dorado?
I love the way they separated the individual styles from the regions to show the gold work, from Muisca, from Tolima, from Tairano. I thought it was very, very beautifully done. And the presentation in the background, you got the beautiful gold on display, beautifully displayed.
Well, okay.
And also into the regional history of Colombia. It was very interesting.
Well, it was the elegance and the beauty of Mrs. Echevarría with that incredible collar colombiano. Thank you, muchas gracias.
It's a pleasure.
Okay.
Muchas gracias.
Adiós, gracias. Eso hablábamos acá con una dama muy elegante que vino con su collar colombiano esta noche. Acá cuando estamos hablando para la televisión de aquí y de allá, la televisión colombiana, la televisión americana, en esta noche tan especial para Colombia. Ahora ya volvemos. Bueno, ahora en ese momento no está hablando únicamente el periodista que entrevista a una personalidad colombiana, sino el amigo, porque me siento tan complacido de alma y de corazón de conocer por mucho tiempo a Pacho Morris. Pacho, simplemente alguien especial y que ahora es el doctor Francisco Ordóñez, superintendente bancario de Colombia. Pacho, bienvenido a Nueva York, como amigo, como neoyorquino adoptivo, te saludamos. Y para este programa que va a estar en la televisión americana y también irá a Colombia, cuéntanos como funcionario, alto funcionario del gobierno colombiano, ¿qué representa desde tu punto de vista la participación colombiana acá en la Leyenda del Dorado para los Estados Unidos?
Por supuesto, Gustavo Alfredo, desde luego que mi complacencia también es significativa. Tú, mi viejo compañero de universidad, el encontrarte en estos momentos pues significa para mí algo muy especial, el volver a ver a un amigo como lo anotabas ahora. Yo creo que el proyecto del Banco de la República que administra el Museo del Oro es bastante importante para el país. Yo creo que todo lo que se haga en materia de causarle y lograrle una buena imagen a Colombia no sobra. Yo estoy convencido que espectáculos como los que hemos vivido como el que hemos vivido esta noche en Nueva York y el que se ha vivido en otros países de Europa con la exposición del Museo del Oro hablan bien de nuestro país y demeritan en mucho la imagen que gratuitamente se le ha hecho ganar en materia de